Today we're going to talk about font licensing. As we talked before the live stream, Joyce said, well, it might not be the most sexy topic of all. And I said, well, come on, it is something that's necessary. You gotta do this. It's basically you really need to talk about licensing. It's like eating healthy or doing exercises. It's mandatory, but it might not be that sexy when you first encounter it. It's easier to eat
Yeah,
the
but
cake.
you sell vegetables by melting butter on it.
That's a good point. That's a good point. So but before we dive into it, let me just briefly introduce Joyce to you. Joyce Ketterer from Darden Studio is the CEO there. She's an expert on font licensing. She's doing workshops on this topic. She's a very kind person. I had the pleasure to meet Joyce in Europe, in Austria, and in Germany last summer. We spent a few hours together chatting, drinking coffee, and Joyce was knitting all that time. And like you're doing right now, don't you?
Well, I had stopped out of respect, but yes, there's knitting in my lap.
That makes you very, very adorable. I really love this about you. You were knitting a hat, I think, when we met in summer.
Yes, yes. Well, it was a gift.
It was a gift, yeah. Okay, so before we dive into this, I read on your biography on
hmm
Darden Studio on the side that you kind of embody a lot of contradictions. You're a dyslexic, you say,
Yeah.
then you also do not recognize fonts. So,
No, not very well. It's like I have face blindness for fonts. I mean, I can recognize our few most popular fonts, but like a person who has face blindness might recognize their kids or they might not. Yes, my chief designer, Eben, says I can't smell the perfume.
yeah, okay, that's a nice comparison. However, how did you then end up as the CEO of a type foundry choice? What brought you there? What's your
Well,
connection
I
to it?
totally fell into it. I am what you get when bohemians raise a child who's good at math. And I was working in a large accounting department of a real estate firm, and I was miserable. And my husband is a painter. This is his work behind me. And he had a studio in the same building on the same floor as Joshua Darden. And Josh and I hit it off because we both were growing orchids. And he needed somebody to run the company. So he talked me into leaving my hated job and coming and running his company. And the original brief was that he wanted to be an employee of his own company. We ran it together for I think like 6 or 7 years. Then I talked him into taking a sabbatical because he was burning out, and then he never came back. And
Oh.
I ran the business with him as a passive owner for a while, and then in 2019, I talked him into selling it to me, and now I pay him royalties. And if I had understood at any point along the way what I was getting into, I would not have done it. Um, and I
Wow.
think that the hmm?
Wow, that sounds like getting kids. No.
Yeah, a little bit. And I think it's actually a really apt comparison because I'm not saying now that like it was a mistake. Like I was absolutely equal to it, but I wouldn't have thought I was ahead of the time if I had known what I was getting myself into.
Okay. So
And a
it's
big part of it was at the very beginning, like I don't think either Josh or I understood the extent to which the licensing is crucial. That the licensing is really your price list.
yeah.
you know, and like I don't know how many people understand that now, and we definitely didn't understand it.
Yeah.
That what you're really interacting with at all times, anytime you're doing any kind of sales in fonts, is the licensing.
Yeah, yeah, that's definitely it's so crucial because let's just when we talk about this topic as
hmm
designers, we often try to kind of ignore
hmm
it in a way because
hmm
back then when I was at design school, you somehow these fonts that fell off a truck appeared on your hard drive. And then
Yeah.
you had them for your design projects and your work. And somehow they stayed there or then they didn't.
Yeah.
And this was basically the idea. But eventually, you do client projects and you really gotta wrap your head around this topic because then
Hmm.
you make decisions. You are the person that is influencing the decision making
Hmm.
regarding the font choice, and the font choice has such a big impact on how your message is being conveyed and how everything feels like and how everything works. So licensing is one of the first questions you have to ask yourself because
Hmm.
otherwise it will not really work. But before we get into the basics of licensing, I just would love to say hello to everyone who's joining. We have Jock here, we have Ildiko. Oh, that's great. Daniela, we have CP Franson, we have then John, we have Jess, we have Wim, we have Jock, we have Barry from Scotland. Oh, from sunny Scotland. That's nice. And everyone joining us, this is also a great occasion for you to ask your font licensing related questions. Later in the stream, I also got some questions that were sent in via comments, via email, via LinkedIn. Ola, hello. Catherine, hello as well. So we have a nice group here already, and we're looking forward to making this interactive, also to giving you the opportunity to ask your questions. So the thing is, why, Joyce, don't
Hmm.
we buy fonts? Do we buy fonts?
Okay, so even my website has a buy button on it, and that's like an information design problem, but generally, no. Generally, you license fonts. It's just like music. Somebody else owns the rights, and you purchase a license, and that license has permission.
So I purchase a license to get the permission of using this font in a particular
Hmm.
way.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yes.
okay. So this is why we actually don't buy fonts. We buy a license for a font.
Yes.
Okay, so then it might be correct to say buy.
Yeah. I mean, yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, music companies say buy. They have the buy button, and you're not buying the rights to the music. So
no.
I think it's a little more confusing with fonts. The thing about fonts is that they're like oxygen. If they were a little bit less ubiquitous, we might not take them for granted.
Brilliant. Love that one.
Thank you.
Yeah, okay. So, but then we already have a lot of fonts available at our hands. For example, when I look at my computer, I see there's Helvetica Neue, there's
Mhm.
SF Pro by Apple, there's Georgia. There are a lot of fonts. Who bought these fonts then or licensed them? Can't I just use them on my computer for whatever I want?
So in most cases, the operating system or some software package license them. And you do have limited use, but probably not for commercial purposes, though sometimes it's very tricky and complicated. And one of the things that's really weird is that the way operating system software treats fonts is basically like plugins. So yeah, it's like the most expensive plugin, but um it's we have no digital rights management
Hmm.
really to speak of. And if, for instance, Microsoft Office and wants to give you access to Helvetica, it may just show up as a system font, and you can't tell that it's the way that it's licensed.
Hmm.
So I wouldn't trust it. The fact that something is on your computer, you need to scrutinize it. And you're not
Yeah.
always going to be able to figure out how you got it. So the odds are you should just get a license. The most dependable thing is Google Fonts.
Yes.
If you have a Google Creative Cloud license, Google makes all of those fonts. They don't give you direct access to the font files. But everything you can physically do from Google, including access it in other software packages, is covered under the license. So, and sometimes that license contradicts the license that the Foundry grants directly. When it does, it's usually more broad. So there are some font foundries that, don't allow broadcast use, for instance.
Yeah, yeah.
It is allowed if you access the font through Adobe Fonts, and they
Yeah.
all have the same license. So that is a really good way if you're doing a small project where you don't have the budget, but you already have an Adobe Creative Cloud license. That's a good way to ensure anything, the things that aren't allowed are the things that would require access to the font file. So
yeah.
sometimes I will see customers who have embedded the fonts on the website and then without permission. And then when we reach out to them, they're like, well, we have an Adobe Creative Cloud license. If you needed to go separately get the files, it wasn't covered.
Yeah, yeah. Because if it's on
Yeah.
Adobe, now we are already into we're
Yeah. Sorry, that might be a bit granular.
all good, all good. But in that sense, it is if you're using it via Adobe Fonts
Exactly.
by using Adobe Fonts to host the font files, then it
Yes.
got you covered. But if you somehow created a web font file or got a web font file of that specific font, and you're using it on the website, you're embedding it on your own server, Adobe Fonts does not cover that use case.
Yeah, and the reason for that is very simple, is that they need to be able to track the use in order to pay to reimburse the Foundry. So if they can't track the use, they can't grant permission for it.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so we already are in a lot of, or we already tackled a lot of issues, saying
Sorry.
oh no, that's all good, all good. It's like open type font, open source or Libre fonts on Google Fonts. We already touched on a bit. Then on Adobe Fonts, that font licensing can be different. It can depending on from where you got your fonts from, and that it's not safe to use any font you find on your computer. I was back then surprised about one thing. So Comic Sans is a classic, Comic Sans. The one I think you recognize this one.
Yes.
Yeah, that's the one everybody recognizes. But yeah, so that one is like, yeah, it's almost ironic to many people. But it's not a system font on Android. So if you want to use Comic Sans on a website that is shown on an Android device, it will not be displayed. So the only way to show Comic Sans on an Android device is to use a web font. But there's not a web font available, or you could generate one illegally though, then it would be available. However, you need to license Comic Sans as a web font. Then you also get the font files from Microsoft, and then you get it. So this was one thing I found a kind of hilarious, because everybody said, oh, I hate Comic Sans. But if you really want to use it seriously on a website, you need to get the web font and license it. You got to pay for Comic Sans.
But true font nerds love Comic Sans. They like it more than Helvetica.
Yeah, that's true. It's in many ways, there are some advantages over that, except for not having kerning. So that's a downside. But coming back to the question of licenses. So what are some popular licenses? What are some basic licenses you find in many use cases? So
I think the first thing go ahead.
Yeah, I know that there are a lot of differences.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the first thing we should do is define our terms. So when we say license or EULA, that could actually be anything. It's any contract granted to use a font, or software, but in this case, a font. And usually when we say the word EULA, which stands for End User License Agreement, we're talking about whatever the entry level license is from the given licensor. So we often use the term desktop to describe that.
Yeah.
My company doesn't say desktop. We haven't for a long time because it doesn't translate well. We used to get people from other countries asking, do I need a different license for my laptop? And so we say basic. Because the basic license tends to have the broadest kind of permission, whatever that is for
Yeah.
the Foundry. It grants many different things. And then the add-on licensing will generally be a specific license for each type. So at the basic level, generally grants installation on computers for use by people to make images and documents.
Mm-hmm.
And then there might be things on top of that, and there might be restrictions on how the images and documents get used. And Foundries tend to be on one of two types of philosophies, and usually, in fact, a hybrid of those two types, which is what I consider the software model and the intellectual property model.
Mm-hmm.
So the intellectual property model worries about how the end product gets used. It's, again, a very good analogy is music. So if you are licensing music, you will charge differently for a movie than a commercial, differently for personal use than professional use. If you are licensing on the software model, you care about how the software is used, but you don't care how the thing created with the software is used. And so Darden Studio is mostly on the software model for our font licensing. So we do not have additional licensing. We permit at the basic level broadcast, logo, ebooks, products, packaging, all of these things, because they all have the same workflow as permitted basic level uses. So the fact that you made an image is all that matters. We don't care where you put that image, right? But there are a lot of foundries that do care where you put the image, and they're doing that because smart people like complexity. They find it comforting, and they think it's more fair. But in fact, I think that complexity is confusing, and confusing people is a mistake. But this is what a lot of these foundries are doing. So something that feels exactly the same, making an image that's going to go in broadcast, you would need not only to pay an extra fee, but also to get a different kind of licensing for that than you would a billboard, which would be covered at the basic level. And that is something Adobe doesn't do, which is one of the reasons why I say that's a good place to start. And there are foundries that don't do that, like Darden Studio, but that sort of thing is very common.
Okay, so
and what Darden Studio, the distinction Darden Studio makes is how the software is used. So for us, it's web embedding, app. Those are also very common.
Yeah. Okay.
Sorry.
So
I realized at the last second that I hadn't mentioned that.
Yeah, true. But that's a good one, because this explains a lot how these different philosophies feel to me.
Yeah.
Because when you browse through their options, you see that many of them, it's I guess it feels a bit complicated, like striking a balance between being accessible and affordable to many projects, and on the other hand, being compensated for the worth of the design in a way.
Yeah.
So just if this one thing blows up and is used on, I don't know, something super popular, then also the designer of the typeface gets a fair share. So
it's thinking about the value add of the creative product as opposed to the functionality of the software.
Yeah. Okay. So, and this is, I think we see a lot of different, or font licensing is, you mentioned commercial versus personal use. What's the difference
Mhm.
there?
You'd have to ask the foundries that do it. It's different every time. And I personally think, again, the reason people do these things, it comes from a good place. They're trying to make it possible for everyone to use their stuff. Everybody wants to make things that get used. But I don't do it. We have a fairly inexpensive single CPU license for our fonts. I mean, it's not nothing by any means, but it's not, I don't think, prohibitive. If you really want it, if you want to go buy everything, it would be, but um and and the and there is no restriction on commercial versus
Mm.
personal, because I think that that's one of the ways that a lot of companies get into trouble without realizing it. I think they don't realize that they're buying a non-commercial license.
Oh,
And
okay.
um and the thing that I worry the most about with this stuff is not what will happen if people do things correctly, but what will happen if they do them incorrectly. And I'm most worried about people feeling like I tricked them into paying me a bunch of money later. Um, because the truth of the matter is none of us read software licenses.
Mm-hmm.
We have been trained by all other software that you don't need to, that the software will protect itself, that you can't physically do the things you aren't supposed to do without hacking the software.
Mm.
That isn't true with fonts. And um and people just proceed. I mean, we don't get them that often anymore, but we used to get a lot of technical support inquiries where somebody was having trouble doing something and they assumed it was because they didn't have the right license. And I was like, broke my heart to tell them that we don't have that level of control over our
Yeah.
software.
Yeah. Yeah. That's true. Yeah. That's also something that I experienced when you're in contact with the foundry. It's always
Mm-hmm.
working out better because
Yeah.
they kind of want to make this, as you said, they want to get their stuff used. They just want to
Mm-hmm.
protect their intellectual property or the value of the work. For example, what I'm using Magnet from Farrah Jones type,
Mm-hmm.
and I got I reached out to them because it broadcasting, and YouTube is broadcasting, was not covered
Mm-hmm.
by it.
Yeah.
And they added this for my purpose, for my license. So,
Mm-hmm.
but I was upfront about it and I read about it. So that's the
Yeah.
thing. You just gotta talk to people. But on the other hand, it feels like many times it gets very fine grained and complicated, and but
It
there are,
does. It
yeah.
does.
For example, when there's a foundry also that offers you the option to license a lot of individual use cases. And I think there we are on the idea of this intellectual property
Mm-hmm.
of this intellectual product that they created. Like you can license it for social media, you can license it for a logo, you could license it for what is it for broadcast, for an app, for ebooks,
Yeah.
obviously as well. But this is then also, as you said, maybe this mixing things because then it's embedded
Mm-hmm.
in the product, because when you're using it in software and it needs to be dynamic, it needs to change, update, then you're embedding it. The same goes for websites. So in these use cases, people definitely have, it feels as a designer sometimes hard because you don't want to get your client into problems or your
Mm-hmm.
project into problems, because suddenly you realize, oh no, I cannot use my typeface anymore. I got a few comments here already on the chat. So
Okay.
hey everyone, hey Katrin, hey Kurt, hey Daniela again. And Katrin also stated that Adobe Fonts, when self-hosted, is not GDPR compliant in Europe. So
No,
that's
so what
true.
she means by
Yeah,
that is used through the Adobe fonts, not self-hosting. So
yeah,
self-hosting is, we have a bit of a language issue here.
yeah, yeah,
If you locally host it, which is what we mean by self-hosting,
yeah.
that is definitely GDPR compliant. The question of whether the Adobe fonts their hosting is GDPR compliant is really a tricky one, and I don't think it's actually been settled in the courts. I have spoken to multiple lawyers, all of whom think it should be covered because it doesn't have the kinds of data collection that are that the GDPR is worried about.
Yeah.
However, judges are notoriously not up on technology, and most large companies and a lot of my own customers just aren't taking the risk. It's not worth it financially
Yeah.
to potentially have to deal with the regulators. So it is
Yeah.
true that most of them don't. But that was not what we were talking about. We just have a bit of a jargon
Yeah.
mismatch.
Yeah, that's true. So self-hosting is when you're hosting the fonts on your own server for your website, and hosting them by Adobe Fonts is using Adobe Font server. And this could
Yeah,
result into an issue with GDPR. It's like using Google Fonts to host your fonts, which they
yeah,
technically could track you. They say they don't. And also for performance reasons, it's always smarter to host
yeah.
fonts yourselves. So, but on the other hand, we had a great question by Daniela. She has two questions. There are so many free fonts. Why should we license at all? And how can we be sure one did not misuse a font? So if somebody just breaks the license agreements.
So you can't be sure, to be completely honest, because the way operating system software treats fonts, it's the fonts have no protections. So you just have to be careful and hope for the best. And most font foundries just want to fix it. They don't want to sue you. So if you get a friendly email from a font foundry saying, I'm making sure you have the right licensing, don't worry. Like usually they're not, there are a few, you can figure it out by Googling it, who are, really honey traps, not font foundries.
Yeah.
Fortunately, several of the worst offenders in that realm have been bought by Monotype. Monotype has a bad reputation for license enforcement, which I think actually is not, I think it's worse than they are. I don't think that their reputation is quite deserved. They tend to be willing to settle, I think, which is
Yeah.
more than I can say for the absolute worst offenders, most of which don't exist anymore. The what was the other question? I took the second one
Uh,
first.
All good. Why should we license it all? Because there are so many free fonts available. So yeah,
Well, that's a personal decision. I don't think there's anything wrong with using Google Fonts, for instance. Um, that is a bucket of free fonts, which I think are ethical to use. And if it works for your project, by all means. There are definitely projects that Google Fonts are more suited for than other kinds of fonts. But there are some really great fonts that you would need to pay to license. And it would be a shame to exclude those from your palette. Also, a lot of the people doing that work are, very talented. If nothing else, you would want to support. And a lot of those fonts are better. Like it depends, right? But there are some probably the best, most robust fonts are fonts you would need to license. They might also be available as system fonts, but if you wanted to do them for a big project, you would need a license. So to eliminate those from your palette, I think would be cutting off your little toe. You might not notice it all the time, but it will affect your balance.
it's a great metaphor. Yeah, on my end, you absolutely are right. There are reasons why we should and can use free fonts. There are a lot of high quality typefaces also on Google Fonts or other free available sources. That's also why I'm reviewing one free font available on Google Fonts many times, or other foundries, because there are projects where you need to be able also to give the project away or to share the project and things like that. And then you cannot always be sure what happens to the font files and license it for any use case. And this would be then problematic. But there are also a lot of situations where you might need that one feeling, vibe, idea,
Hmm.
also maybe character set is
Yeah.
not covered in your specific use case. So these could be some instances where it makes sense. Then we have also the other thing with what I find, let's say, a bit it when it gets very, it's like, should it be accessible? Should it be easy to license, or should it be protect the rights of the typeface? And one question I got here from Florian, who posted this on LinkedIn, is he just said, for some good looking fonts, they are very expensive for private use, but they feel kind of cheap for companies when they're using it for their brand book or whatever. And he's just asking, is he doing something wrong? So,
No, I think he think he's not wrong. I think he's probably right that that is true. And I've been in the font world for 20 years, and there have been many, many attempts to get fonts, to make fonts more desirable for consumer grade use. And nothing ever gets traction. It just isn't a consumer grade product. And I personally have given up. We price it for companies, and there will be some consumers who spend the money, but uses pricing is based on volume of use. So but it's still, no, I think that it's not a consumer grade product. It's not an impulse buy. We, you know, we we make things that then earn back their investment, if at all, several years down the road.
mhm,
It's like, it just isn't for consumers. And there have been so many attempts, I could rattle them all off, to try to make fonts more accessible to consumers, and they just never have traction. It's
mhm,
just, we're not the ones deciding that they aren't for consumers, but they just aren't. So if you're the rare bird who wants them, then, it I think you're best off getting them through Adobe Fonts or Font Stand,
mhm.
which, Font Stand is not very popular, but it was one of those really good ideas, and it's still around.
Why is it not very popular, do you think?
I really don't know. It's a fantastic idea that isn't as popular as it should be. It's a font rental service.
Yeah.
Um, do you need me to explain it?
Yeah, sure, please go ahead.
Yeah, so there are a bunch of foundries that participate, and the price for a rental is 10% of the retail price of the font, and you get it for a month.
Mm-hmm.
If you rent for 12 months, then you don't pay again. The license you have paid 120% of the retail price, and it transfers to you.
Yeah,
And
that
it's a
sounds like a
basic
great
desktop
idea.
license.
Yeah.
Yeah. You have to access the fonts through their app, which might be the one of the things that makes it less popular. You're
Yeah.
not installing it directly on your system. So there are some use cases that don't work.
Okay.
Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, it was a brilliant idea. And they have a pretty decent library too. A lot of the
Mm-hmm.
best foundries do participate. And they do a conference every year. That is good if it travels. If it comes to your town, it's going to be in The Hague in March. If it comes to your town, I recommend going to it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but yeah, there are not a lot of consumer grade options because the attempts usually fail.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense to make this also more accessible, usable,
Hmm.
like Adobe Fonts in a way is also making fonts more accessible to designers, but then this might be a bit more exclusive library then.
Well,
So,
Adobe, yeah, well, I wouldn't say that the Adobe Fonts is more exclusive than the font stand
Yeah.
library. They're different, but they're using the same initial screening method, which is in both cases, they only want to work with highly professional foundries that they can rely upon to maintain their fonts and to handle customer support.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, you know, it's and there are definitely foundries that are with font stand that Adobe would like to have and doesn't, and vice versa. And there are, I think there are very few, they're both, font stand, once a foundry is accepted, that foundry can upload any font, whereas Adobe is curating its own font
Okay.
collection at a more
Yeah.
granular level. But there, I wouldn't say that one is a better library than the other. They're just different.
Yeah. Yeah.
We're with both.
Yeah, yeah. So just to pay a little attention to the chat, I'm super happy that things are there. There's a lot of conversation going on, and
Oh,
thanks a
cool. I
lot.
wish I could see it.
Yeah, all good. It's just some things. John is asking, Jock is asking some things about performance, and Kurt is giving some great answers. So thanks a lot, Kurt and Ildiko. So, but I want to stick to licensing here, and we have a
Mhm.
good question from John. And John writes, "How do designers and foundries decide on the right price for a license?"
That's true. I'm sorry. There's like more answers than there are designers and foundries. And, but um, and it also depends on the type of licensing and how they. So Darden Studio does. There's a whole bunch of kinds of licensing that other foundries charge for that Darden Studio doesn't, and foundries will sometimes be like, but you're leaving so much money on the table. No, we're not. We're slicing the pie up differently. Our
Mm-hmm.
all in, if you got every kind of licensing from us, price is very similar to theirs, and vice versa. A a customer might come to us and say, your web embedding is really expensive, and that's because they're only looking at the web embedding. And yes, we do charge more for web embedding than most other foundries, because we only have like 4 slices of the pie, and these other foundries might have 20.
Mm-hmm.
But the generally it's a volume model, and it is based on quantity of use
Mm-hmm.
and quantity of styles.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, that makes sense. When it comes to licensing fonts, it seems still that there are a lot of options, and I just would like to use this occasion to give a brief overview of some things, and you could comment on them
Yeah.
because I just
Okay.
collected a few examples here, and let me just briefly share my screen. So there we go, and you don't see anything yet. Gotta
Okay.
find the window I'm dragging over.
Okay.
Technology. So, all right, there we are. Now, as we already discussed, my fonts, and
Mm-hmm.
which is part of monotype, like almost everything.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a place where a lot of people license fonts. We got this in German right now, but yeah, I think can I change the language somewhere? I guess I can, but let's just you will get it.
I'm
We
seeing English
you sing English here?
in the Word document. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Then I'm sharing the wrong screen.
Not the error.
No,
Ah,
you know technology. I'm bad. So everybody leave the live stream. He's so bad. So no, I'm sharing other screen. So I got 2 desktops and I'm sharing the wrong one.
okay, there you go.
There we are. And the
Oh,
thing
so
is,
you're showing the my fonts.
yeah, I'm
Yeah.
showing the my font side.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the
Okay.
first thing I would say is, if you can avoid it, don't license from my fonts.
Why do you think so?
Because the foundry um, may have different licensing. And I mean, it's a real problem. So, it's it's better for everyone if you stay inside the same license. Like, so you get desktop and then you get web fonts and they are like attached to each other. They're the same. Whereas what Adobe does, or not Adobe, sorry, what Monotype does is they allow the Foundry to give their own desktop license, basic desktop license, but then they use the Monotype license for all the add-ons, and you can end up with weird conflicts that are going to make things more complicated if you have
Oh,
questions or problems.
okay. Yeah,
There
and
are companies that, the accounting department thinks fonts are paper clips, and they say we have a font vendor and you can't go to other font vendors, so you're stuck. But
okay.
if you're not stuck, I would recommend going directly to the Foundry.
Okay, interesting. So the thing that I also heard from many foundries and know is that you actually do not, most of the times you get a better deal when licensing directly through the foundries, plus the foundries also get a greater share.
Sure,
Yeah,
sure, but I
because
was trying to frame it in terms of the self-interest of the
yeah,
customer, not
yeah, not the
altruism.
foundry. Yeah, but we're
Yeah,
always about supporting indie foundries here, so that's something I
sure,
also want to add on.
absolutely.
So, but you can see very well that how they separate these things. They also have this desktop license that for your
Hmm.
in your way would be the CPU license. Then we have web
Yeah,
fonts. They changed this to annual. It was perpetual before then, and
yeah.
this is a big difference now because it is not as easy to convince clients. So again, this could be two things, but when it's a small project, it might be rare to afford a special license to license a font
Hmm.
even, and then you need to pay it annually. So
So
that's
I
that.
actually
Yeah.
deeply disagree with this.
Yeah.
Everybody believes this thing that you just said, and I think it's
Yeah.
not true.
Okay. Please.
All right. So I think the reason people believe this is because a lot of the perpetual licenses were too cheap.
Yeah.
Some of the more prominent ones
Yeah.
were too cheap.
Yeah.
But I can tell you that Darden Studio did not want to do timed licensing for our web embedding, and our customers demanded it. And
Really.
that was because the perpetual license was too expensive for shorter projects, and it should be. It
Yeah.
should be. It makes absolutely no sense that somebody who's doing a project for 1 or 2 years would find it
Yes.
affordable to buy a perpetual license. That doesn't jive, like, at all. And a lot of companies, like, I think quite prominently, um, um, FontSpring, right?
Yeah.
FontSpring?
Yeah.
I get all of these names mixed up. Really confused perpetual with no hassle.
Mm-hmm.
And they're not the same thing.
Yeah.
And if you compared their um perpetual price to, not even mine, say
Yeah.
Font Bureau, frequently their perpetual price was less than Font Bureau's 1 year price. And that's just, obviously too low.
Yeah.
Um, and um, and so, I do, the way Darden Studio does it is that we have a 1 year price, and that there is a formula that goes out to perpetual.
Okay.
Um,
Yeah.
and regardless of how long a license you get, you have to report. Yeah, it's not actually here.
On the side. Yeah.
Unfortunately, it is on the website, but it's not where you are. If you go to any one of the fonts,
Ah, okay. So if I'm now browsing a
yeah,
font like,
menu, pick a
yeah,
font, any font.
yeah,
Now go to buy, see, because it's a buy button.
yeah, yeah.
And then just pick a style.
Ah, okay. Any style?
You have
Okay,
to pick a
let's,
style
yeah.
first. And then now you don't, and you can do 0,
Ah, okay, yeah.
right? And now if you go to web embedding,
Mm-hmm.
so basic is always perpetual.
Ah,
And
yeah.
then web embedding has, yeah.
I see. Yeah. And I,
And so there, and regardless of how many years you license,
yeah.
you will have to report at the end of each year
How many users you had?
how much your traffic.
Page views. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Average monthly
Um,
page views. Yeah.
yeah.
hmm
And so effectively, even if you are getting a perpetual license with us, it might as well be an annual license because you're reporting every year. If your traffic goes
All
up, you're
right.
paying.
Okay.
You only pay the difference. There's no penalty. But um, the majority of our licenses are not perpetual with this
Yeah.
system.
Yeah. I
So
see.
we're giving choices, and most of our customers are choosing a timed license.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
the idea that it is hard to talk a customer into a timed license, I just don't think it's true. We wanted perpetual at first because it was less work for us,
Yeah.
and none of our customers would do it.
Interesting. Yeah, but you also give this, so to say, it feels like being cheaper as something or a more affordable. In many times, it's just not affordable and still not affordable with perpetual then,
Sure.
or even not affordable in any way. Yeah. But coming back to some other models that you find, for example, here,
Mm-hmm.
when we have from Fontwerk, also a foundry I really like and treasure there, they changed
Mm-hmm.
their licensing model a bit. They kind of started out with something a bit more, some, let's say they had some options that were like collections of options or some bundles. But now
Mm-hmm.
you kind of add things individually. You start out with the desktop license and then you add web and you add all other kinds of use cases to it, which then affect the price of the typeface. This was one approach that I saw many times. And just to give another option here,
Mm-hmm.
this is something that I also really like about DJR, who is
Mm-hmm.
making these things affordable for smaller projects to try things out. Like here, for example, you have this for 3 workstations, then 15,000 monthly unique web visitors and one app or ebook. But of course, there are limitations, but you gotta figure out what
Mm-hmm.
the exact ones are. But this also kind of makes things a bit more approachable. Depending here, this would be the software approach that you talked about. Um, and not the
Yeah. Yeah. I
intellectual
mean, this is
approach. Yeah.
basically what we do, except that we don't
Yeah.
bundle in this way.
Yes, yes, that's true. You leave options for people. Then
And
Elena
we
Mun.
don't, and ebooks are
Yeah.
covered at the basic level for us.
Oh, okay. That's cool.
Yeah,
Uh,
because ebooks are still, the technology for ebooks are still basically PDF. So
That's yeah,
embedded
yeah,
PDFs are permitted at the basic level, not forms. We do make a
yeah,
distinction between informative, basically read only PDFs. And, if, so we have a lot of companies that are, like telecoms and insurance companies. If they're sending out a form to be filled out, they need to get a embedding
yeah,
license for that.
yeah. I'm
But
jumping
I think
back.
it's really silly that you would charge extra for an ebook, but not charge extra for a paper book.
Yeah, that doesn't really make any sense. Yeah, that's true. And but going back to the question of perpetual, Daniela had a question about the word perpetual. Is that monthly payment or by user?
It's going to depend on the company. But for Darden
Okay.
Studio, the perpetual means one-time payment unless your traffic goes up.
Okay. So it just means so no end date and like continuous
Yeah.
payment. Okay. So that
We are going to change this so that perpetual means perpetual continuous use.
oh that may
So,
yeah, okay, that's easier to
because it's
understand.
it's
Yeah.
very hard for us to monitor if,
Yeah.
for instance, a company stops using the fonts for a couple of years and then goes back to it. We
hmm
just,
Yeah.
you know, but yes, perpetual means
Buy once
no end
and
date.
yeah, okay. But if your page views change in that sense,
Yes.
so if you now I bought a perpetual license or continuous license,
Mm-hmm.
and now my page views go up to 50,000 average page views per month. So then I need to relicense or to
No,
upgrade.
you would upgrade. Yes.
Upgrade.
So
Okay.
you would
Yeah.
pay the difference in price, no pen, Darden Studio. Others may charge penalties where, the thing I didn't want to do is act like an American cell phone company. So if you have overage, you simply pay the difference. Essentially, when you're buying a license from us, all prices are live. You're
Yeah.
paying for a prepaid maximum. But if you go over, you just pay the difference. There is no penalty. If you have a perpetual license, you
Yeah.
can choose to just pay for 1 year. If you
Yeah.
think that this was an anomalous year and you had a bump in traffic that isn't going to continue, or you can expand the whole perpetual.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, makes sense. Now, there are also other ways, like here, for example, Elena Munro, also a wonderful type designer who I featured several times from Canada. She has also this, you can, of course, you get some bundles that might be cheaper than when you select the whole family, you get a cheaper price, like with many other foundries. Then you see also for which use case you want to license. So pretty straightforward like the other ones, only that she's also giving you the education option, which makes this for free. So this is an addition.
So we do have an educational discount, but we treat it differently in our shopping cart than she has. And it's only 50%. Only.
Okay, all good. And then we have things like here, for example, like Pengram, and this is very granular again. It's like you choose a print license, then here again, it's intellectual property for what use cases might be a web. Oh, it's so tiny, the text is super tiny. So it's bad typography. Then
web app, social media logo.
Yeah.
That is not super granular, by the way. Like it can get so much more granular than that.
That's true. That's true. I had another option here as well. Let me just find it out. I think it was from Black Foundry or something like that. When they kind of, there are also companies that kind of want to charge for the company size. So depending on the size of the company, which is also seems to be like a popular model in a way.
Yeah, and I would say that is the IP model.
Yeah, okay.
Because what they're trying to do is they're determining the value of the use based on the value of the company that is using it. That's very much about how intellectual property thinks about things. And I think it misunderstands how fonts are used. I think it assumes that all use is branding use. I also, I've read the more prominent of these licenses, and I think that they're confusing. And I think that they're necessarily confusing because they're doing something very, very complicated. I at one point, I think I put it on Instagram when I taught my workshop, people had drawn an infograph to try to understand the ABC Dynamo, first user, second user thing. And it's just, I think, that it also misunderstands risk. It's misallocating risk. Like these companies, these foundries that are doing it this way, they really freak out when they see a large company get a small license. They're afraid that they're being taken advantage of when that happens. And I will tell you that we have, every time a large company buys a small license from Darden Studio, I watch it. And there is a very, very, very small fraction of those licenses that turn into violations. Because usually they didn't get it for the brand. There's some other reason, some other internal reason. And so I think that they're creating extra friction and confusion because they're misallocating risk, personally. And that's why, Darden Studio does not do that.
Yeah,
there was a question that someone posted that I wanted to make sure to answer. And I can go long if you've got people, but we have 2 minutes on the official stream, and I wanted to make sure to answer this question, which was it was about who should have the license, who should be licensed. And do you have that question? Can you read it?
I have the question. But just regarding timing, if you're still having a bit of time, then we could go over time.
I'm happy
like
to go.
a
Yeah,
few minutes, yeah, like 15 minutes or so. No worries about
sure.
that. And I really would appreciate it because we got into it very deep, Joyce. I really enjoy this
Yeah.
conversation. So, and I still got a few questions. Yeah, let me just jump there. What was this one? Yeah, this one was about for whom I had one from Olaf, who sent me a question about licensing.
Mhm.
What licensing framework and legal agreements do we need to handle multiple clients' corporate fonts in a platform? So, for example, or for instance, they are building a platform where e-commerce businesses can create real-time AI-generated offers, but use their own typefaces or
Yeah.
fonts there. Um, and each of these offer will using this client corporate fonts. What about the licensing there?
There's going to be different for every Foundry, but the most important thing you can do for your infrastructure is make sure that the fonts are sequestered to your clients.
Okay. Yeah.
Because I've run into this with platforms that come to me and say, we have a client that needs to use
Hmm.
this font, and I would be able to license it quite easily if it's sequestered. And if it's not sequestered, they have to pay for a license for all of their suite of clients. And then that
Hmm.
becomes prohibitively expensive. They don't want to pay for it themselves. Their client doesn't want to pay for other people to be able to use it. And you basically can't do it.
Yeah.
So that's the most important thing, is make sure it can be sequestered. And then the particulars of how you license it are going to depend on the Foundry.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, then we have another very, very popular question among people from Florian here. He posted this one on LinkedIn about logo usage. When he buys a font, can
Oh,
he use it
sorry.
for,
There was one I really wanted to make sure that we asked.
yeah,
It was, um, when I'm getting a license, is it illegal or something like that for me to, I'm trying to
what?
use the language they use, for me to
Oh, there,
get the
when
license for
I get the
myself,
one.
for my client?
When building a website for my clients,
Yeah.
am I allowed to purchase fonts on their behalf? For use on their websites, or is it mandatory for them to purchase the fonts themselves? So should the client license the fonts for their website, or should, in this case, it was Ildiko who asked the question. I think she's still joining in the stream and in the chat, but this was her question. Who should
So I
license the
wanted to
font?
be sure to answer this because the answer is the client should always get the license. And it's not for the reason that Ildiko asked. Most font foundries will allow you to get the license yourself.
Hmm.
They will. They don't restrict it. Darden Studio does restrict it, but most font foundries won't.
Hmm.
And do not do that,
Hmm.
because if you should insist that your client get the license, because you don't want to be caught in the middle. If say you fire your client because they're awful, that's the kind of client who might go pirate some extra styles or vastly exceed their traffic, and then
Oh.
all have some sort of major violation, and then the foundry doesn't know who you are. The foundry will
Mhm.
contact the client if there's a violation, but then the client can say, well, our web developer bought this license, go talk to them. And I get that all the time, and I say, they didn't, I wouldn't have allowed them to.
Mm.
But other foundries come to me sometimes because I'm known as a license enforcement expert, and they say, what do I do? And the answer is, if you really did allow the developer to buy the license on their own, there's not much you can do. They
Mhm.
probably don't have the money. They're probably not going to be able to pay you, and you're never going to be able to collect from the end client, because the whole reason this mess exists in the first place is because they were a terrible client. And
Mhm.
so the again, I don't think about what happens when things are done right. I think about what happens when things are done wrong.
Yeah.
And so it is better to just have this is a contract. Darden Studio will only enter into a contract to permit web licensing with the owner of the named brand associated with the
Mm-hmm.
website, because that is the only way to have a valid and enforceable contract. And
Mm-hmm.
if you are a developer, you should act like us because you don't want to get caught in the middle. I mean, this is
Mm-hmm.
not legal advice, it's logistical business advice. I'm not a lawyer, but
Okay.
I would never ever get a license in my own name if I was a developer.
Yeah, yeah. That makes sense for embedding it into an app, for example, or into a website. But does
Yeah.
this also count for making graphics? Like,
No.
no, it
No,
doesn't.
because if you make a graphic, then you transmit the artwork. It's rasterized.
Mm-hmm.
If they want to do anything to it, then they have to go get the fonts.
Yeah.
Now, if I would count it for a broadcast license,
Yeah.
right? Because even though the broadcast license is making a graphic, right?
Mm-hmm.
So anytime you're dealing with add-on licensing, regardless of the workflow, I would refuse to get the license in my own name.
Okay. Yeah, makes sense. This also brings us a bit to the logo license or the logo usage
Sure,
use
sorry.
case.
Yes, you
Yeah,
were
all
trying to
good,
ask me
all
a
good.
logo
Yeah,
question.
yeah. But which is why when I buy a font, can I use it for a logo as well?
It depends on the foundry. In most cases, yes,
Yeah,
but they're not everybody.
yeah. Also, many of them will prohibit you to use one character or glyph as a logo. And
Yeah,
it also can depend. Also, things that I encountered was that it's not allowed that you can manipulate not the software, the outlines of the font in
I
any way.
don't. Again, not a lawyer, and this would
Yes,
be different in different countries.
yes.
But I'm pretty sure that that's not enforceable.
I don't think so either. Yeah. Bec
Drawing on top of it, is, I mean, it would depend on in different countries. Certainly in the United States, I don't think it would be enforceable.
yeah. Yeah.
And but you don't want to make an enemy of the foundry anyway, so maybe don't do it. But like, there's other things like, where they say no political speech, probably not enforceable. Like, if it hasn't been tested in court, we don't know.
Yeah.
But
Yeah. Yeah. Makes sense. Yeah.
yeah, the whole single glyph as a logo thing is, I think, really tricky, because at what point is it really a logo,
Yeah.
right? And like, you probably have multiple, if you have a single glyph, that's probably one word mark in a stable of word marks.
Mm-hmm.
So then you could argue that it's an abbreviation.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it depends on how wealthy you are and how many lawyers you employ.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So the other question I got was when doing. So this was also interesting because
Mm-hmm.
it is when I sent also by Illico, it is one when I send my work to a printer, is it
Mm-hmm.
sufficient to outline the fonts in the PDF, or does this still pose legal issues even though the fonts are embedded in the PDF? By the way, if you outline the fonts,
Yeah.
comment from myself, it's not embedded anymore because it's
No, it's
transformed
not.
into a vector, so the font file is not embedded anymore. It's just the visual representation of the font is in there. So if you outline this and send it to a printer, will there be any legal issues?
Again, it's going to depend a lot on a lot of things. And most printers, it's not good enough for them. They actually need the files to be embedded, which means, just to define our terms, embedded means to include the software in the other software, to include the font software in the PDF software. And most printers need it. A lot of font foundries have a printer exemption. So Darden Studio says that our fonts are non-transferable except to printers. You can send them to a
All right.
printer
Okay.
because we know
Yeah.
the printer's not going to save them. They don't care. They just want to print your thing and be done. Like,
Yeah.
the fonts are clutter to them.
Yeah.
Um, but it is very much a question. All of these questions, there's no one answer.
Yeah.
It's, how does the individual foundry
Yeah.
handle it?
And maybe this also brings it to one of the final questions I would like to ask
Mhm.
still, which is about what happens if we do not meet the agreements or if we violate these license agreements. What could happen? So this is also a question. I know it
Um,
depends, will be the answer,
yeah,
but
it depends. It depends. Most foundries, including Monotype, just want to fix it.
yeah.
Some will charge a penalty. Um, most of them will negotiate with you if you pay quickly. Um, some will go away and stop bothering you if you cease the use and it was small because it's not worth
Hmm.
it to them to keep pursuing it. Some, it is a matter of honor and they will stay on top of you. Like everybody is different, you know.
Yeah, yeah,
But it'll probably start with a polite contact and I would, try to just respond quickly and, just try to fix it. And that is how Darden Studio is.
yeah.
Um, but
Yeah, it will
there's no
depend,
one
of
answer.
course. And that's also the thing. Even though you could use it, it
Hmm.
still doesn't make it legal and it still doesn't make it right. So
Yeah.
it's like, yeah,
Well, the legal is a very, people say legal all the time, and I
yeah,
never
okay.
do because the law is generally one thing and the contract is another. You can put anything in a contract. And there are frequently things in the contract that like would be permitted under the law if the contract didn't exist. And there are frequently things in the contract that wouldn't be enforced under the law if it went to a court, but it's still not worth it to fight over.
Yeah, yeah.
Like it's not about the law really. It's about the contract most of the time.
Hmm. Yeah, makes sense. Makes sense. So we have still another final question by Katrin here. Before we
Hmm.
close it, I want to be respectful of your time. Thanks a lot, Joyce, for spending so much time with us.
I like
The
doing this stuff.
Oh, that's great. So
I
we
always
could
learn something from the questions.
Yeah, yeah, me too. And Katrin asks, is there a font organization software out there where I can make notes according to the license board from for client or manage, etc., in search of good font organization tool? Um, if you have an answer on that, maybe I have one.
I mean, I only know of two, and neither of them have really great notes.
Yeah.
But you tell me.
I'm not sure either. So it's like I'm using Right Fonts right now. They
Hmm.
have, I don't know even if you can make any notes in there. And, but still, even if you could, the way I organize it, I just make groups. This is a
Yeah.
free font. This is not a free font. Maybe this is one thing that we should
Hmm.
tackle before we close it still. But a free font, or this is open source, and this one is for personal use. So I kind of, when I get them, I group them. That's my way of doing it. But you always gotta check it again when a
Yeah.
project comes along your way. So, and this is then very
And we
critical.
should talk a little bit about Google Fonts before we go.
Yes, Google fonts and free fonts, because free font doesn't mean it is free to use. Free is how you got the font, isn't it?
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, that's not how I think of it, but it's a perfectly reasonable way to think of it. Um, uh, the Also, like Darden Studio has a font that is free at the basic level, but you would pay if you do embedding. Um, Google Fonts are Libra, which is, I think, a
Hmm.
very important distinction.
Hmm.
The
Hmm.
Libra licensing is not the same as open source, and it's not exactly the same as free.
Oh,
Um,
okay.
so, because there are restrictions and there are controls, a lot of the most popular Google fonts, there is a trademark on the name. So
Hmm.
if you, the Libra license does permit you to, say it doesn't have the language support you want, you could add the language support. But if you do that, you'd have to change the name. You're
Okay.
like
Yeah.
required to change the name. You are violating the license if you don't change the name.
Hmm.
Um, because the original creator wants to control what is existing under that name.
Mm.
Um, the the other thing is you can't ever take a Libra font and make it paid. So if you add language support to the Libra font, for your client, you can
Mhm.
charge for your labor, but
But
that
not for the font.
license is still both a Libra, that license, you can't charge them to license your work.
Hmm. Hmm.
And also, they can't keep that license from the public. They
Hmm.
are required to keep it a Libra license. They can't then make it a proprietary font.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, so so it's not free in that it's not entirely, you know, Wild West. Like you
Yeah, yeah.
have there are requirements and there are things that you have to adhere to in order to comply. They're just not financial.
But this seems to me more or more circling around the issue of changing the font.
Well, a lot of it is circling around the issue of changing the font. Because but that could just be changing the format of the font.
Mm,
It doesn't
okay.
have to be the design work.
Yeah, 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 makes sense. Other question regarding this is you have a free font, okay, and then
Mm-hmm.
you have the commercial fonts. So all fonts on Google Fonts are Libre fonts.
Correct.
They are all open source then?
No, because
No.
Libra and open source are different things.
Okay, what's the difference there?
That's what I was talking about. Open source, I'm not this is not my area of expertise, but open source is, I think, more, it's less restrictive than Libra.
Ah, okay. Hmm.
I think.
Yeah,
If you really want to know, get Dave Crossland on your
yeah.
stream.
All good. All good. That's a great suggestion. So this all kind of when summarizing this, what I learned
Mm-hmm.
today, most of the times it depends.
Yes.
Yes, unfortunately, always does. You,
Unfortunately, I'm
you
sorry.
should
Yes.
check your font license before choosing your fonts, which is something that's very essential always. Checking the
Mm-hmm.
licensing before making a
Or
decision
check with the Foundry. Or
or
check
check with the font. Yeah. Is
because
this
it's not always going to be clear.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. I also had some cases where it was not necessary that I purchased a desktop license because I was doing this for an app design, and
Mm-hmm.
and they said no, just you don't have to purchase a print because it was a print license, and I'm not
Yeah.
using it for print. I'm just yeah. But
And
it
that's the Darden Studio zero CPU thing.
yeah,
If you were, for us, that's how we treat it. It's like if
yeah.
you're just for the app, then you would do zero CPUs for
Oh, okay.
basic
Yeah.
and then the app license. It's the
Yeah.
same idea.
So you clearly spent so much time thinking about this
Yeah,
choice.
I know. I'm sorry.
No, that's no, don't be. I'm
Well, no,
delighted.
but
Thanks
that's
a
why
lot.
I'm here. I'm here
Yeah,
to spend time thinking about it so you don't have to. And I'm sorry
yeah,
that you still have to.
yeah, that's true. But it really seems very straightforward when you explain it. Coming to an end, is there something you want to tell our audience, which is mostly designers, developers, who what they should keep in mind, or um, just when it comes to font licensing?
The software doesn't protect itself. It's, we don't, the license is actually crucial. It's the one situation where you really do need to care about the license. We've all been trained not to think about licenses when it comes to software.
Yeah,
And you do have to with fonts. And in fact, the person who made the font might not think they made software.
yeah. So always thinking about licensing. That's a good point.
Unfortunately, yeah.
Where can people connect with you or find out more about the things you're doing, workshops you're giving to Foundries and other people?
Well, I We don't currently have, the only workshop upcoming right now is at Font Stand in The Hague in March. If you're a member of a design organization, it's not just Foundries, I would love to do a workshop. Feel free to ask me. You can connect with me on Darden Studio's contact form, on various social media channels. I'm not the person running it, but it'll get to me. And, please subscribe to our mailing list. It is the number one way to be aware of what we're doing, and it is the thing we care the most about.
Yeah, yeah. And you're releasing some beautiful typefaces. Gamma was one of the recent ones that I also reviewed on the Font Friday blog and newsletter, which I really appreciated to dissect and take a closer look at, and it's all its possibilities. So check also Gamma on Font Friday and on Darden Studio. So
yeah, and we're making merch. And
yes,
the merch that we're making is mostly manufactured letterform products. So right now we have scrubbies, like front sponges to wash your dishes. And we're going to be coming out with bandages.
nice.
We might do jubilites, which is our font jubilate with jubilat with what's the filament in the
Yeah,
shape of a letter.
yeah.
So watch our merch store.
I definitely will. So thanks a lot for joining today, Joyce. And
Of course.
everyone else, thank you for your question, for your wonderful engagement in the chat. I really appreciated all your questions, and also the lively discussion that I could observe. Unfortunately, we couldn't answer all your questions, but this gives us just another reason to invite Joyce again in the future. So thanks a lot for everything. See you in the next one. Bye.